Welcome to diplomacyindia.com. I am V.N. Jha and you are watching our special show, The Bookmark. Today we have with us Dr. Uttam Sinha, the co-editor of the book MODI Doctrine, Changing Paradigms in India's Foreign Policy. Dr. Uttam Sinha is the editor of Strategic Analysis and also a fellow at prestigious Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, the government think tank at New Delhi. This book is a singular attempt to evaluate Modi's foreign policy in his halfway term. Now let us talk to Dr. Uttam Sinha. We'll ask him the few questions about the book itself. Dr. Uttam Sinha, welcome to Diplomacy.
Thank you.
The first thing our viewer would like to know from you is what is the central theme of the book, the Modi Doctrine? How do you evaluate 2.5 years of Modi's foreign policy? And the allied question, what is Modi Doctrine?
Well, let me begin by saying first that the doctrine word itself is a sort of a controversial word. But it was essentially picked up with a great deal of discussion and careful thinking. We felt as editors that over the last 2 years there has been a flurry of foreign policy activities. We have seen a very high level of engagement. There has been engagement of ideas. There has been also a lot of stress on institution building that helps these ideas. So we thought as editors that the 2 years essentially give us the impression that there is a making of a doctrine, and it is time basically to assess what that doctrine is and how it will pan in the next couple of years. So that was our first approach to this whole foreign policy initiative of the Prime Minister Modi and his government. The second point was that we essentially as editors wanted to make it an assessment. We wanted the writers who are extremely capable analysts at various senior positions. We wanted them to assess the foreign policy in the last 2 years. What has happened, what are the challenges ahead, what are the pitfalls that might emerge, what are the good points that we have scored, etc. and etc. We wanted the authors to speak truth to power and not for it. And I think they've done a remarkable job with a lot of courage and conviction. They have spoken and they have assessed the foreign policy. The chief tenets we found through the writing of many of these analysts is that, there are 4 things that really emerges as what we can describe as a Modi doctrine. The first, I think, quite clearly is that the Modi doctrine doesn't hesitate to reach out. It doesn't hesitate to put India in the forefront of global affairs. It wants to be seen as an important actor.
What do you say, historical hesitation? I think,
or what it can be described as overcoming the historical hesitation. And that is quite remarkable in foreign policy, which has remained largely for India a 1 step forward, 2 step back approach. So I think that was the first clear reflection of many of the authors writing in this volume. The second, I thought, which was very clearly demonstrated in the writings, was that India is no longer just seen as a rhetorical country. It has moved significantly from political rhetorics to significant approaches in world affairs. And therefore there has been a sort of realignment of India's position in the world. And I think that was the second important aspect that came out from many of these writers and the writings that we found in this volume. The third was, and very importantly again, was that there was obviously a mandate in which Modi came, and for a large part of time the domestic and the external were sort of separated by many a miles. But I think in this doctrine what we see is that there is no distance now between the external and the internal. It is becoming increasingly a matter of public affairs, which was not so the case earlier. Foreign policy was always, or foreign affairs was always seen as something exotic, beyond the thinking of the ordinary men. But I think now we see that there is a tremendous involvement of public.
So that's what I think you mean to say. that in the globalized world, foreign policy is getting closer, I mean, getting closer to home.
To home,
Okay.
absolutely. Because
Fine.
as you see in this whole approach in the last 2 years, the foreign policy approach has been, getting the internal and the external sort of cemented on many things. Look at in terms of investment. Look at in terms of the diasporic community. Look at in terms of the big schemes that India has, skill development, schemes related to education, many of our own defense production schemes. The internal and the external each time is coming closer and closer. And I think much of our initiative in the foreign policy domain is based on what can the larger public gain out of it.
So Dr. Sinha, then in that case, your new paradigms in India's foreign policy, it justifies, I mean, whatever you have been saying. So this is the paradigm shift which has taken place in Modi's foreign policy when compared to the previous prime ministers or previous governments.
I would agree.
That's what I think.
I would agree. But also to underline the fact that often people will think that this government seems to be dismantling many of the past approaches.
Okay.
I do not think that is the case. I mean, foreign policy is a continuity, and that is very understandable. But there are certain nuances that are being brought in to this approach that sort of makes us think that yes, a new doctrine is evolving. Recalibration.
Or rebooting, as you have argued in the book.
Very well said, yes.
So the continuity is there, continuity in the foreign policy is there. Basically, this is the rebooting.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Uttam, you have also talked of problem-solving ability of this foreign policy, this diplomacy of Modi, or the go-getting age of diplomacy, and the problem-solving and providing the solutions.
Yes.
What do you exactly mean by this?
Well, I think it's very interesting because if you look at Prime Minister Modi and from where he comes, that will position what he does. I think he comes from Gujarat. He's had long experience in dealing with administrative aspects. He looks for solutions for a wider number of people. I think he's brought that element in foreign policy itself, finding solution for the benefit of the larger community. When the Indians are in trouble in various parts of the world, how do you quickly get them back to their homeland? It's become a very active diplomacy. It's becoming a diplomacy which puts the feet on the ground.
Or diaspora itself.
Or the diaspora itself, getting them sort of regenerated in their thinking, getting them attached to the country from where they originated, etc., etc. There's also a great emphasis on the cultural way of looking at the world, the civilizational aspect of it. So all this is solutions seeking. And also his approach, again, is rather administrative in foreign policy. So there's a lot of coordination and consultation, not only between the center, but also between the states. For example, you look at the number of consultation that is happening with UP, Bihar and West Bengal when it comes to relationship with Nepal, probably West Bengal and Bangladesh.
And the chief minister is going in the delegation.
And yes, so there is a lot of consultative approach to his foreign policy, which is administrative in thinking. And look at the number of liftment of the people we have done from the Gulf centers. So, you know, that is a strong sort of change in approach. Also, the first responder approach that he has brought in, you know, like for example, in terms of disaster, you know, you send in your people to help others. And that we saw very much in the case of Nepal.
Dr. Sinha, the very curious thing which analysts talk about, several analysts say that it's a kind of charmed offensive by Prime Minister Modi, a highly personalized approach to foreign policy, leaving his imprint on the wider footprint of India. I mean, the scorching diplomatic earth policy of Prime Minister Modi in this case, if we can say this. Your book argues that, okay, that is there, this personalized style, but basically it is not the charmed offensive. I mean, this charmed offensive is getting attuned to the providing solutions to India's needs, providing, serving India's national interest, its economic diplomacy, etc. So we should not evaluate in terms of charmed offensive only. What do you say about that?
I would fully agree with this. I mean, there's obviously a charmed offensive because foreign affairs often tends to become a very personalized affairs because it is a person who is representing the country and his traits, his manners are, you know, sort of well captured by the public in general and also the media in particular. So that obviously will be there, a personalized approach, his flurry of activities, his energy that brings in. But I think behind all this, you know, behind all this, if you examine, there is an aspect of how does foreign policy, how does the global affairs, how does India's interaction in the international system help India itself, the larger public. So that, I think, is the defining line of his approach. So
okay, Dr. Sinha, so thank you very much for being with Diplomacy India.
thank you very much.
This is V.N. Jha with Amay Sathe for diplomacyindia.com at IDSA, New Delhi.